Okay, so I think I think we are more or less all here. So I would like to start today's DH lunch and introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Hernández Lorenzo, and she is a doctoral candidate at University of Seville, and she mostly deals with Fernando de Herrera and other Gold Age Spanish poetry. And today she will tell us a little bit about the research that she's been doing at our institute for the past month and a half. So, giving you the voice.
Thank you very much for the presentation. First of all, I would like to thank the Computational Stylistics group in Krakow for their warm welcome, and especially Professor Pacheco for giving me the opportunity of being here learning from them. And in this talk, a state-of-the-art or stylometry research to Spanish literature will be firstly introduced, and we will apply these techniques to one of the most fascinating textual and authorship problems in Spanish Golden Age, which affects the poetic works by the Sevillian poet Fernando de Herrera. It is a part of a PhD project funded by an FPU, Spanish Researching and Teaching Fellowship by the Spanish Ministry of Education. So, we will start with this state-of-the-art of stylometry and Spanish literature, then we'll move to the state-of-the-art with the poetic works by Fernando de Herrera, and exactly what are the reasons of the controversy and the polemic with these works. Then we will move to some computational linguistics and stylometric approaches to this problem, and then to the stylometric analysis, in which we are going to combine some approaches. And finally, I will give you my conclusions and the future work I plan to do and show you my references. So, although there are important problems of authorship in Spanish literature, we have still very few studies applying stylometry and non-traditional authorship attribution techniques to Spanish texts, especially in comparison to the studies available for other languages, such as for English literature. Nevertheless, some progress has been achieved so far. So, for example, stylometry has been applied to the two most important anonymous works in Spanish literature, the Lazarillo de Tormes and Avellanera's Quijote. On the one hand, stylometry techniques have been applied to the Lazarillo by Javier de la Rosa and Professor Nanette Riesler-Picka, and the Lazarillo has a great significance as it is considered the inaugural work of the picaresque novel, which has a very big importance in Spain's Golden Age narrative. In the stylometric analysis carried out by Javier de la Rosa and Nanette Riesler-Picka, although they were not able to pinpoint the author of the Lazarillo, they have been able to discard some candidates, which constitute a very significant improvement. On the other hand, Professor Nanette Riesler-Picka and Javier Blasco have performed a stylometric analysis on Avellanera's Quijote, the apocryphal continuation of the first Quijote, which is believed by some scholars to have been written by one of Cervantes' enemies. The results have been quite interesting because the similarities of this apocryphal one with Cervantes seems to be bigger than suspected before when they have carried out this stylometric analysis. In addition, an stylometric analysis of 20s novels is being performed by José Calvo as a part of the CLICS research group in Würzburg University. And apart from that, there are some ongoing stylometric approaches and research, for example, on Alfonso X's medieval works by Professor José Manuel Fradejas at the University of Valladolid, on comparing Góngora's and Picasso's poetry by Professor Nanette Riesler-Picka, On Golden Age Mythological Fables by Antonio Rojas Castro, and on Golden Age Spanish Drama. Last but not least, computational stylistic research is being performed in the ASO project with the Spanish Golden Age sonnets and in postdata project at the Lingunet. In spite of this effort, there is still much work to be done, especially in Golden Age literature, which is famous for the abundance and significance of authorship problems suffered by literary works. In Golden Age Spanish poetry, one of the most important and fascinating problems is the one with Fernando de Herrera's work, which I'm going to present here. Fernando de Herrera is one of the greatest poets of Spanish Golden Age and has been considered a crucial writer in the change from the Renaissance style of Garcilaso de la Vega to the Barroque style of Góngora. He published in life only a book with his poems in 1582, Titles and Works, also known as Age, which contains 91 poems, and is a selection of his own poetry prepared by Herrera, so we have no doubts or problems so far with his authenticity. Okay, so it's clear that this first book is authentical. But his works suffer of one of the most fascinating problems of textual transmission and authorship in Spanish literature. Some years after Herrera's death, the painter Francisco Pacheco, especially known for being the father-in-law of the great painter Velázquez, and who was also an admirer of Herrera as a writer, published a new book with Herrera's poetry titled Verses and known as P. It included new poems and different versions of some of the poems published in some works. In total, we have here 365 poems presumably written by Herrera, and 82 have already appeared in Age, but they have very significant differences and variants. And we also have a corpus of manuscript poems, which we know for sure were written by Herrera. And from these manuscript poems, one of the most interesting is the one conserved at the Spanish National Library called Cisnes del Betis, and known as B, which contains 130 poems, and some of them are also in H, some are also in P, some in both H and P, and lots of them have variants. Since then, and especially from the start of the 20th century, academics and experts in Herrera's poetry have discussed about the authenticity of verses for decades without reaching to an agreement. So, on the one hand, erudite Italian academics such as Oreste Macri, Salvatore Battaglia, or Inoria Pepe Sarno defend Herrera's authorship and the probability of an evolution of Herrera's style towards Baroque and the poetry of Góngora. On the other hand, recognized Spanish philologists, especially José Manuel Blecua and Cristóbal Cuevas, totally reject this possibility and suspect from a possible hand from another writer in the text, presumably Pacheco's. Because apart from painter, Pacheco was a poet and an admirer of Herrera's poetry. Another problem is the preliminary poem on verses, which was written by Pacheco, in which Pacheco presents to the public this edition he has prepared, presumably of Herrera's poetry. Because he says that he's going to offer to the public, and he says exactly, in the true form I imagine, this works by Herrera. So the problematic part is this, in the true form I imagine. And those who defend Herrera's authorship think that imagine here equals copy, because it was general use in painter essays at the time, painter essays. And he was a painter, they think he's using this word with this meaning. But those who reject Herrera's authorship think imagine equals invented, that he made it up. So we have here another problem, how we interpret this. Previous studies in this question have used traditional methodologies such as philology and textual criticism, but due to the extension of verses, they couldn't get to definite conclusions. Experts have admitted the difficulty of doing it without using an approach which allows the researcher to work with entire corpora. Therefore, close reading has proven to be insufficient in facing this question, but there is a chance for quantitative, computational, and stylometric approaches to show not only how they can change our perspective of literary history, but also their interest in shedding new light when traditional close reading and philology can do it. Well, so with this aim, we are going to combine methodologies from computational linguistics, computational stylistics, stylometry, textual criticism, and history of literature. And the computational and stylometry approaches will help us to obtain more objective data, more objective information about the text, whereas the traditional traditional methodologies will help us to interpret those results, because every computational study needs of an expert who is able to interpret correctly the results, and that is an idea which is present in a comparative digital humanities and in later studies. So when they say no final result, let alone the interpretation of a text, can be obtained by computer power alone. Human interpretation is indispensable to arrive at meaningful results. Well, so with this idea in mind, the text of Herrera's poetic works was first digitalized through Blequa's authorized edition using OCR software. After that, the text was revised and corrected. The original orthography was maintained because of its interest as another indication of variation between the two books, but we created a copy in which the orthography was standardized to actual Spanish standard orthography. At the same time, we have collected Pacheco's poems from different sources. Some of them were found in his book Art of Painting, which is digitalized in Google Books, and the book of portraits, and the rest of them have been transmitted in collective books and extracted from them. In this case, we created also a modernized version of the text. After that, the corpora were contrasted using our do-it-yourself Java software tool, a corpus tool specifically developed to work with poetry, because experts in Herrera's poetry also recommended contrasting methods that were not able in the existing options on Ancon, Goldsmith tools, and other software tools. Moreover, existing software was not prepared to work with poetry and does not show vital information such as break lines or the title of the poems, or for example, the line in the poem in which the occurrence appears. All these options have been included in our software, and before getting to our actual analysis, there was a first work using of Herrera's prose using concordances, but the problem with this previous work is that it only uses concordances, and what it gives us is just a list of the word list. So we only have lists of word lists in PDF. So we don't have the text that they have used. They have used the text of a printed edition. So if we want to repeat analysis, we will have to OCR the printed edition with time consuming as it is, and we can do further processing with this if we want to go for more complicated analysis. So one of the first problems actually with Spanish literature is the lack of available text in a suitable format to do textual analysis and computational analysis. Our first approach was from the methodology of corpus and computational stylistics, and from the computational analysis of poetic genres in some works using keywords and concordances. It was possible to characterize the style of Herrera in each of them, adding interesting information to classical studies made by philologists. Then we also contrasted the two editions, the edition published in Life and undoubtedly by Herrera, H, and the dubious edition, P, and we found that in the keywords, keywords from H seems to be more balanced, less violent and hyperbolic, and there seems to be a big presence of the exterior world of the nature and the woman, whereas the keywords from P seem to be more violent and hyperbolic, and there seems to be more subjectivity and words related with speakers' love suffering. After that, we did an analysis with part of speech, tag corpora, and we did part of speech tagging using Freelink, which is a software developed by Universidad Politécnica Catalunya, which works really well with Spanish text. And we developed a new function in our software in Litconc in order to tag the text using Freelink, and another option to extract information on morphological categories. So I first studied the evolution of morphological categories in H, in some words, in P verses, and a subcorpus containing the exclusive points of P, which was called P2. I was looking for tendencies from H to P2, and for example, as you can see, seems to be a progression of ascendance in conjunctions, where it seems to be a progression of descendants in pronouns, preposition, and interjections. Okay, sorry, I finally skipped that slide. Well, the interesting thing is that if we move to this slide, we have added in B, and some of the progressions, which I was talking, if we look only at H, P, at P2, are not longer here, but the progression of descendants in pronouns and interjections it is still here, and seems to be interesting as pronouns and interjections belong to this category of function words, which seems to be a special interest in stylometry analysis. Okay, if we add also Pacheco's text, we see that there seems to be big differences in the values between Pacheco's morphological categories and Herrera's text. Which seems to be much different, that the difference between the other texts seems to be less significant between the supposed Herrera's text. And if we look to the visualization, we can see the evolution from B to P2, and it is interesting how H, P, and P2 seems to be very similar in terms of part of speech, and B seems to be a little different. So maybe H and P are not so different as scholars thought, at least in terms of part of speech. And finally, there is the evolution from B to P. The direction of the evolution seems to change sometimes, so we have a progression from H to B of ascendant or descendant, and then it is corrected in P. We think this is related with this Battaglia quote in his paper per il testo di Fernando de Herrera. Here he says, quei componenti scartati da Herrera nella stampa del 1582 H e che si legano nella redazione del 1578 B e nel testo del 1619 P mai sono passati a questa senza un'energica revisione. So we think this explains that some progressions that we find from B to H may be corrected in P, but in order to be more similar to H, but there is also a revision. They're not going to be the same as in H. So we think this also sheds new light on the previous computational analysis. And well, so in addition to the stylistic differences that we have previously found using corpus stylistic approaches such as keywords, it seems to be some interesting things to be considered in terms of part of speech, but it is not clear if the change in style is because there is another hand in verses or reflect an evolution of Herrera's writing. So here will come the stylometric analysis. Just a minute, because I think I have another slide here. Okay. Okay, here. Okay. So first we have tested the strength of Herrera's signal. And in his late research, Professor Pacheco concludes that the performance of a given text in stylometry not only depends on the size, but most importantly of the strength of the authorial signal that the text has. So we have tested it with Herrera, and as you can see, he seems to have a very strong signal, because it seems that with about 1,000 little more, we will have very high accuracy. So what you're seeing here, the red circles are the 100 most frequent words, the yellow one 200 most frequent words, the green one 300 most frequent words, the cyan ones 500 most frequent words, blue one 750 most frequent ones, frequent word, sorry, violate 1000 most frequent words. So it seems that Herrera has a very strong and stable signal, and we expect to have then very reliable results. Well, given this, I think I need the mouse right now.
You need the mouse. The mouse
Yeah,
is all the
yeah,
time.
yeah.
You just need to
Okay,
click.
okay. Sorry.
It's sometimes it's just
Okay.
freeze.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So, the first stylometric analysis I have performed, given this complex problem of authorship, in which a considerable amount of the previous poems by Herrera are included in verses and exactly the same, other with few changes, other with great changes, I decided to apply rolling stylometry as it is presented by Pacheco in a paper in 2016, published in Digital Humanities. And well, as it is used to assess mis authorship through sequential analysis, I have performed it using the Stylo package by Vega and Kestemon. And there have been also other studies using these techniques by Jan Rybicki, David Hoover, Mike Kestemon, and also by Helmut Ilsman or Tomoyi Tabata. And it seems to be really well. But however, as far as I know, there is no published study of this method applied to Spanish literature. So I decided to make a first test on a collaborative work in which we know the takeovers of each of the authors. So for this reason, I chose this drama by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and Fray Juan de Guevara, in which we already know that the first and third acts were written by Sor Juana and the second by Fray Juan de Guevara. And I use a support vector machines, a sample of 3,000 words, and as you can see, it worked fairly well. So in this first stylometric approach to Herrera's disputed words, we use this stylo package, and our aim is to measure more scientifically the probability of Herrera's authorship in verses and, if possible, reject or not Pacheco's hand. So, in order to do that, we use as a reference corpora Herrera's and Pacheco's poems. In Herrera's case, we use A's and words and the manuscript poems written by Herrera, which is the corpus whose authenticity we are sure about, and there is a total consensus among scholars. On the other hand, we use a compilation of Pacheco's poetry. And as a test corpus, we will use both verses, but also the unique performs of verses. So, first of all, we use support vector machines, which 100 most frequent words, 5,000 word samples, 4,500 words overlapping. And as you can see, there seems to be no probability of Pacheco's hand. Then we move to P2, we still don't see the probability of Pacheco's hand. We move to nearest ranked centroids, and here seems to be a very little probability of Pacheco's hand, but that is not in the principal line of authorship, which is red in its entirely, which is entirely red. And if we move to P2, it seems to be more or less the same. And if we move to delta, the first author that pinpoints for the test, the first option in delta chooses is Herrera, and as a second option Pacheco. With P2 we have the same. But we had something that here that may be influencing the analysis, and is that Pacheco's poems are much smaller than Herrera's one. After collecting of Pacheco's poem, we only have 5,085 words. And the test corpus is also bigger. So we have done another analysis with a random reduction of each corpus to 8,000 words. And as you can see in the random sample, first with support vector machines, still the text is entirely it's chosen to be written by Herrera. With nearest ranked centroids, we don't see probability of Pacheco. And if we move to delta, the first choice is Herrera, the second is Herrera, and the third is Pacheco. And this is also going to be published nextly in the near future. So if anyone is interested, can have a look at it. Unfortunately, it's going to be published in Spanish. And but we also have done some experiments adding a control author to see to further evaluate our results. And here we had a little surprise. Adding Góngora as a third author, as a control author, we have chose Góngora because he seems to be stylistically related to Herrera, as Herrera seems to be a bridge between Garcilaso and Góngora. There seems to it appears a part in the visualization which seems to be written by Pacheco. If we do the same but with delta, suddenly this part disappears, and we have for as a first choice for all the text Herrera again, as a second choice Pacheco, and as a third choice Góngora. Well, seeing that there has appeared something problematic, we have done another analysis adding another control author. In this case, Garcilaso de la Vega, which was also very related to Herrera, Stylistica, and to the Golden Age Spanish poetry of the time. And as you can see here with support vector machines, it chooses for all the text Herrera, and as a second, well, and there is some probability of Pacheco, but it does not appear in the main choice. If we move to delta, the first choice for all the text is Herrera, the second choice for all the text Pacheco, the third Garcilaso. So adding Garcilaso as a control author, it seems that this signal of Pacheco's text of Pacheco's hand in Herrera's text disappear. Well, so far we have with this we have the analysis without control authors, in which we haven't seen any signal of Herrera's hand. We have the analysis with Góngora as a control author, in which it has appeared as this signal. And we have this other analysis with Garcilaso, in which it disappears. So in order to further evaluate this, I have done a third experiment adding another control author to see what happens, if we see again that Pacheco signal or not. And as you can see, with support vector machines, we don't see again the Pacheco signal, and with delta, we don't see again the Pacheco signal. So after seeing all this, we conclude that that signal that has appeared in only that visualization and in a very concrete circumstances maybe is not very representative, but it has to do with the percentage of in which the technique can make a mistake, which of course all the stylometric techniques are not perfect and sometimes can make some errors. So we think it's not a very relevant one, as in the other analysis it doesn't show, and even in the adding Góngora in the delta analysis it doesn't show. So we think it's something that didn't seem to be very representative, that maybe has to do with a part of Herrera's text with an authorial, with a less strong authorial signal. But we think after doing all of this that is not something very representative. Okay, so well, so after now, we think that it seems that there is a weak probability of Pacheco's hand in verses, but we don't know if Herrera is the author of verses or not. So, and in order also to contextualize the results we have obtained so far and to evaluate them, and we are going to check with a bigger corpus. We are going to use again the stylo package, and well, we are going to use a combination of habitual methodologies which are using stylometry. We are going to use cluster, bootstrap consensus tree, principal component analysis, and network analysis. And we are going to combine all of these methodologies because Stover and Kestemont say that in present-day stylometry, it is common not to limit a study to a single technique, but to compare the output of different methodologies. In the virtual ascent of ground truth, well, they're talking here about historical corpora, but at the other hand, in Golden Age, Spanish poetry, there has been so little, almost none approach, stylometric approach. So we are just, we are also in this absence of ground truth. We don't know what's going to happen when we're going to work with the test with these methodologies. So they said in these cases it was required to assess the stability of experimental outcomes using different methodologies which all have their strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so we are going to combine all of these methodologies also because this is also a very complex problem. And so we're going to, in the end, we hope to have some new light to the problem and to the authorship of Herrera. Okay, so we have used a wider corpus, and we have used the ATSO corpus, which has been prepared by Borja Navarro Colorado, Maria Ribes Laguz, and Noelia Sanchez. And this is a collection of sonnets by more than 50 Spanish authors from the start of the 16th century to the end of the 17th century, in the Golden Age period. And what he have done is replace the Herrera's, the ATSO Herrera with Herrera's corpus. We have done it too because the Herrera's in the ATSO corpus, the Herrera's tests were collected from the Cervantes Virtual Library, and unfortunately there are some poems of P included there. So if we are not sure if this is if these works were actually written by Herrera, we can't use them as a part of the Herrera's corpus beforehand. So we are using our corpus with all the works which we know for sure were written by Herrera, and we also have added Pacheco's poems which are not in the ATSO corpus. So we are going to start with cluster analysis and consensus tree, which are very frequently used in stylometry. They are unsupervised methods, so they visualize at a glance which tests are more alike than others. And but as it is explained in this paper, results can change in cluster analysis depending on the number of most frequent words involved. So we are going to use not only the cluster analysis, that is the reason we are going to combine that with the bootstrap consensus tree. So we have more stable and reliable results. So, for example, this is the analysis with delta distance, and we have on the left the cluster analysis, and on the right the bootstrap consensus tree. And as you can see, Herrera's, see if this is working, maybe I can pinpoint it. Well, if you search for Herrera, it appears, it is in dark green at the end of the cluster graph, and it appears together with the unique poems of P, the unique poems of P with this subcorpus of P2. Okay, so Pacheco also is near, but it's not at nearest. If we move to the bootstrap consensus tree that you have in the right, and we search again for Herrera, we have it more or less in the middle right side. So there are Herrera sonnets, and they also appear together with the sonnets in P2. Okay, if we change the measure that we have used and use cosine delta, which in this first attempts at analyzing Golden Age Spanish poetry with stylometry seems to perform better, and with this text, we see that again Herrera, which is now in the cluster analysis, is about the middle of the cluster. Of the cluster visualization, is again put together with the poems of P2. And if we look at the bootstrap consensus tree, again you can see it at the bottom, about the center. Herrera is put together with the sonnets in P2. We have also, as we have the different corpora by the corpus of each of the authors have a different size. we wanted to make sure that the results were reliable and that size was not influencing them. So we have repeated with random samples of 1,800 words, because in the previous text we have performed with Golden Age with this same corpus of Golden Age sonnets. It seems that with about 2,000, a little less, there seems to perform well if the authorial signal is strong enough. So so that's the reason we have selected this size for the random samples. And as you can see, if we see the cluster analysis, Herrera is at the between the first names, and is also put together with Pichu. And if we look at the bootstrap consensus tree, Herrera, which is in this graph, it's about pink, I think, similar to pink, and it's also put together with Pichu and with the disputed works. So so far, we can see that in the applying different measures and changing the settings, some of the poets change in their place in the visualizations and the graphs, but and Herrera's also changed in the place where it is placed. But so far, Herrera seems to be always put together with Pichu, which is which we are looking at right now. Now we are going to present the principal and component analysis, which is an stylometric technique which has obtained good results in authorship attribution. Especially, my testimony has obtained very good results with assessing the Apuleian corpus or Hildegard's attributive works. And we are going to, well, it is recommended to use 3 or 4 authors at most in principal component analysis. And we are going to see we're going to use Herrera, of course, Pacheco, and 2 control authors. And for that role, we have selected Juan de Arguijo and Luis de Góngora because for 3 reasons. The first one is that they belong to the same time, to the Golden Age period, but also to the time where probably P was written. And the second reason is that in the text we have performed on the strength of the authorial signal. They both seem to have a very strong signal, so we think that it's going to give us a more reliable results. And the third reason is that they have, according to literary scholars, strong similarities with Herrera's style. So first, we have done the principal component analysis with 3 authors and using as a control author Juan de Arguijo. So as you can see, before putting the disputed work, each of the authors seems to be put in a part of the graph, and the works are of each of the author are quite near. So it seems to work fine with these authors. And then if we have the anonymous or the disputed work, more to say the disputed work, it appears right between Herrera's works. Then we have done another analysis with random samples. So we use here these random samples of 1,800 words. Well, unfortunately, we are only using Pacheco's poems in one file because it has 200 about 200 words, and if we split it, it's going to be it's not going to be enough to have reliable results. But we have the 2 of the rest of them, and as you can see, again, in this random sampling, the disputed words seems to appear with Herrera's works. And for example, in Yeah, it seems to be in the same place. Oh, sorry. The graph you have in the right is the graph with the random sampling, and the one you have in the left is the one with the two control authors. So with Juan de Arguijo and with Góngora, instead of 3 authors, 4, using 2 of them as a control authors. But well, as you can see in both of them, the disputed work seems to be closer to Herrera, at least if we compare it to other authors. So, and the problem about the previous methods is that it's harder to see relations of greater relations of genre, of literary history. So that's why we also have used network analysis, as Herrera seems to be, according to a scholar, a very important role in the evolution in the golden age Spanish poetry. So we wanted to see how Herrera's and the disputed works play this role in the network analysis. So this is the network analysis of golden age Spanish poets, and as you can see, for example, Herrera is at the top, and it's also close here to the disputed text. But most interesting thing here is that when separating when using modularity in Jeffy, there seems to be like 3 groups, and we have this group of poets which are in green, which surprisingly coincides, or not surprisingly, coincide with the Renaissance poets of the first half of the 16th century, and we have Garcilaso de la Vega, Juan Boscán, Gutiérrez de Cetina. So this considered by literary scholars more Renaissance authors. And then we have this orange group in which we have Herrera, and we also have another writers such as Francisco de Medrano, Cervantes, which are reaching in the second half of the 16th century, and some be considered by some scholars to be transitional poets between Renaissance and Baroque. And then we have this last group of purple poets, in which we have Quevedo, Góngora, Sor Juan Inés de la Cruz, Lope de Vega, Trillo y Figueroa, and these authors, Argensola brothers, these authors who have a more Baroque style, and are writing also in the late years of the 17th century, but more predominantly in the 17th century. So if we do the same but with random samples and see what happens, more or less the proximity of the author seems to be the same. If we look at the degree, there doesn't seem to be big differences here in degree using cosine delta. And if we look at modularity, we have again these 3 groups with this green one with Juan Boscán, with Garcilaso de la Vega, this orange one with Herrera, Francisco Medrano, Pedro Espinosa, and this violet one with Quevedo, Góngora, and the Baroque poets. And it is very interesting because this agrees with what literary scholars, as I was saying, say about the evolution of golden age Spanish poetry towards the Baroque. So Begoña López Bueno, especially in her studies, talks about these 3 groups of poets, and defends this theory of this important group of transitional poets, which are like a bridge and are like a bridge between Renaissance and Baroque, in which Herrera would be one of the most important. Well, to conclude, we think we have shown the interest of the application of stylometry to Spanish Golden Age. poetic, dubious or anonymous works, and even those with mixed authorship or suspected or having different hands. We think that apparently there seems to be a good probability of Pacheco's hand in verses. We have seen that strange visualization, but after repeating the analysis with the other settings, we think that it seems to not be relevant as it doesn't appear as we change these settings. And in comparing with, but we also have to take into account that in more Pacheco's poems are found to add to the reference corpus, maybe the results could change. But, well, according to the data we have today, there seems to be the idea of Pacheco's hand in verses or Pacheco's authorships of the news poems, which is the principal belief between the authors who reject the authorship of verses, seems to lose strength. And in comparing with a wider corpus, Herrera seems to be a very strong candidate, and because in all the stylometric analysis that we have done, in all that analysis pinpoint Herrera as the only author of verses, but this is a work in progress, and we would like to apply a few more techniques, especially authorship verification ones, before getting to definite conclusions. So here you have the references, well, a selection of the references, and that's all. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Laura, for this beautiful talk, and I would like to ask our listeners if they have any questions that they would like to ask you.
I always have some questions. So your conclusions or your analysis seem to be very strong. So the signal is presumably there. But rather than asking about the methodology, I would ask a question about the corpus or the Herrera's works as they were published, right? Because it resembles the situation that we have in Poland with the transition from the Renaissance to Baroque, with one poet which falls into those two categories, whose work was published 25 years after his death by his younger brother, 25 years later. And his younger brother says something in the preface to this collection of poems. So I'm just giving it to you, all of my dear audience, all those poems by my brother. But those poems have been revised by a certain priest, przez pewną osobę duchowną, as it says in Polish. So we know that the style might have been slightly adjusted. We don't know, we have no idea to which extent, right? And I'm talking about that because it resembles the problem with this Pacheco interventions, right? How he imagines the ideal style of Herrera. But since in this Polish situation we have no other evidence, in your Spanish situation you've got those previous two books by Herrera, right? So the question is, to which extent can we believe that those two previous works by Herrera were not copy edited by any Pacheco or any of his colleagues?
Yeah. The edition that he published in life, Some Words, Age, was published by Herrera and by Herrera himself, and we know that he also was in all the printing process, supervising what was being printed, and even doing corrections when there was some mistakes in the printing process. So we know for sure that in that edition it's almost considered as an autograph, because although it is not it is a printing edition, he was there in all the process correcting everything and supervising everything. So we have no doubts that that edition reflects his authorial choices to the last all the that respects every stylistic decision he could have. And well, the other works, the manuscripts, poems, would him seems to be more problematic, but Herrera's scholars have been working with them from the moment they appear, and there is a consensus between all scholars, all Herrera's scholars and Golden Age scholars, that those manuscript poems belong to Herrera. So there seems to be no. The only thing is that although there is a consensus that B, the poems in B were written before H, the rest of the manuscripts, which are there, some poems we are not sure exactly if the moment of the writing. But the authorship of Herrera is a total consensus between critics, and they have already used that corpora in order to make the advances they have made through textual criticism. So, for example, B has been proved to be very interesting in order to see the chronological order of Herrera's works and see that B was the previous one, H the second, and if P was really written by Herrera, or there is not another hand, it would be a later work. And yeah, there is a total consensus about that. So the documental we have also documental evidence I think. So it would be, I think, very strange to find that they not belong to him. Yeah, with all the consensus about all the critics and the documental evidence and so on. Yeah.
But he knew Pacheco at the time when he was writing it? Did he know Pacheco? Friends already at the time when he published it?
I'm not sure if Herrera and Pacheco met, because Herrera was a friend of Pacheco's uncle, of the which was also called Francisco Pacheco, and Pacheco's uncle organized meetings of artists, writers, and there Herrera was one of the ones to attend. But I don't know right now if we have evidence that they actually meet in person at some moments. What we know is that Pacheco is a great admirer of Herrera's works, and not only because of the preliminaries of P, in which he explains the reason he has for publishing Herrera's works, and says how he admires Herrera's poetry and how he thinks that it's a poetry that must have a very important place in Spanish, in Golden Age poetry at that time, and that needs to be more recognized, because also at the moment of the publication of verses, it seems to be that Herrera was a little mistreated, and also in the book of portraits, Pacheco has a section dedicated to Herrera, and he also talks about him, about his life, and and tries to do something, and he's also he shows his admiration for this poet, for Herrera, and I think I'm trying to remember, but I think we don't have any evidence, but although I'm not sure that they actually meet each other at a moment, or that Pacheco's only have access to his poetry, and because also Herrera Pacheco is younger, and Herrera in his late years it seems that he was very isolated. So seems also less probable.
Do you have any more further questions?
Which method do you like the most? Like, because you mentioned a couple methods here that you like using. Which one do you think is like most effective? With the least work involved?
Yeah, okay. Well, as far as I have seen in the references I've been consulting about the stylometry, there seems to be that stylometry methods can each of them have their the strength and their weakness, and that their performance also can change depending on the text and or concrete circumstance of the style, etc. So that's why my approach has been combining all these methods and see if they are all in the same direction to see if they are reliable results and to further evaluate that result. So I'm not deciding for one, but because as far as I have read, yeah, I think that there is not one which works perfect with in every situation.
So you advocate basically a use of all of them.
Yeah, I'm basically using all of them to make sure that what I'm getting is the right conclusion.
If I could add something to this, because it seems to be a very, very important question. Okay. If you consider a bunch of methods, you would intuitively choose just the best one, right? But in practice, it turns out that there are some methods that are apparently very accurate, but not very reliable. So there's a risk of false positives. Or the method says you something, but you don't know to which extent you can predict that. And on the other hand, there are some methods which are very reliable, but not very precise, right? So it seems to be a trade-off here, right? So that's one of the reasons you pick more than once, just to see if the pattern reappears from one method to another. This is not just a quest for the method, right? So that's the reason we just don't want to stick to just one.
If I may return now to the traditional reading of the text. So, what is the most convincing evidence, from close reading the two writers? Who wrote what? I mean, it doesn't have to be conclusive, but what are the arguments in like, what is the, I mean, because obviously we are clutching at straws using stylometry, but let's see what's going on in, what the literary scholars said about, this is he or this is not he.
Okay.
So what
okay. Basically, we have these two groups. So, for example, the group who reject that P was written by Herrera say that it could not be written by him, for example, because Herrera is a Renaissance poet and P seems to be much more Baroque. But this argument has been criticized because they say it's a very subjective argument. You read the text, you think that it's not the style you're expecting, so you think it's not written by that author. And also, José Manuel Bleco, which is the one who has arguing this posture, also says that there are some works in P which seems to be very ancient for this moment of time, and there are also some other works which seems to be much more Baroque, and he thinks that another person, concretely Pacheco, has changed, has made those changes because he wanted to adapt Herrera's poetry to the stylistic fashion of the time, which was Góngora's Baroque. So, but this point has been argued by the scholars who think that this was written by Herrera, because, for example, by Oreste Macri. Oreste Macri actually has a book, a entire book of reasons and and why he thinks Herrera is the author, and analyzing Herrera's style and explaining he sees an evolution from B to P, a very coherent stylistic evolution, which he thinks is the most important argument to believe it was written by him. So, for example, Oreste Macri says that these ancient works, for example, is not because there have been changes done by Pacheco in order to it's not because Pacheco has made them bad, but because Herrera is also very influenced by the previous literature, by medieval literature, and the poets in the medieval. So and Oreste Macri thinks that these more Baroque works has not to be that with a fashion at the time, but with an evolution of the entire style of Herrera between B to P, and he tried to argue that through his book, in which with traditional means he is searching the evolution of words between these between the different words, how they are the suggestions are changing between the poems, in the same themes, and there are some words which are used differently, and he tried to argue that this is all the part of this evolution of Herrera's from the Renaissance towards the Baroque. But the problem is that his reasoning and his book have not convinced the author, who reject their probability. So the problem that we have with the traditional stage of the art is that they are arguments on one side to reject it, and on the other side to defend it, but they are not convincing each one to the other. And sometimes the arguments can be a little subjective. For example, this thing about thinking that if it is more Baroque, it could not be produced by a Renaissance poet, or for example, thinking that they could appreciate this stylistic evolution through only looking at variants, which from my point of view, it may not be enough, because also we have a very huge corpus of poems, so you have to analyze every variant. Is going to, and I think with these methods, with computational and stylometric methods, we can extract more objective data to see that we are getting actually to objective conclusions.
Still, I mean, it all revolves around that one terrible word, as I imagined. Like the bastard couldn't have written, straightforwardly what he did.
Yeah, absolutely. But the problem is that the authors which are convinced, and we have very important scholars which are convinced that this was written by Herrera, they are also very convinced that this has to do with the use that this word have in the painter-isis and the time. And as Francisco Pacheco was a painter, maybe why? Well, it seems possible that he uses the word with this meaning. He in his text of painting of would use. So yeah, it's very problematic.
Apart from your stuff, you should really write a novel about it.
Yeah,
So we
maybe.
can analyze this later. Cluster
There
analysis.
you go.
Okay, are there any further questions? If not,
Jakieś takie luźne uwagi mogą być? Czy tylko pytania?
are you taking just comments and not questions?
Yes. Okay.
Zacznijmy od tego, że niestety literatura hiszpańska w Polsce nie jest tak dobrze znana, a literatura Złotego Wieku już bardzo słabo. Dlatego po prostu...
Poczekaj, może ja bym tłumaczyła, żeby Laura wiedziała, okay? So what he's saying is that Spanish literature is not well known in Polish, especially the golden age Spanish poetry.
Po prostu mamy o wiele mniej przykładów niż na przykład z literatury angielskiej. Jak możesz potwierdzić, powiedzmy z Szekspira mamy 7 pełnych przekładów sonetów co najmniej, no a poetów hiszpańskich mamy pojedyncze sonety.
So there are very few translations into Polish from Spanish literature compared to especially English literature. And well, usually if there are translations, there is only one additional translation or something.
No i dlatego po prostu każdy tekst o literaturze hiszpańskiej właśnie tego okresu dotyczący stylistyki, wersologii, stylometrii w Polsce jest bardzo potrzebny i mile widziany. Dlatego chciałbym właśnie zaprosić panią prelegentkę, żeby coś dla nas napisała właśnie o tym okresie.
This is why any comment on Spanish literature, be it in a written or oral form, is very well received in Poland. And we would like to ask you to write something introductory for us, perhaps. So maybe this is something to consider.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I would also like to give a little organizational info. So thank you all for the participation in today's lunch. We'll be meeting again next week, once again in Authorship attribution topics. And this time we will be listening to Daria Glebova, who will be talking about the anonymity of some Icelandic sagas and how she deals with them with the use of Stylometry. So you're invited, and thank you once again.